All right, we've been covering some breaking news that has just developed. President Vladimir Putin of Russia has put his nuclear deterrent forces on high alert. Now, the U.S., as you know, maintains with Russia a balance of power of nuclear missiles that would mutually assure the destruction of either one if one of them were to launch it. This is interesting because a few moments ago I was telling you about the SWIFT system and removing Russia from the SWIFT system. One of the reasons it hasn't been used is because it would be such a strong sanction that people have referred to it as the nuclear option. Except that it's not. It doesn't have any nuclear weapons associated with it. It's just that serious. It does seem that under pressure, Vladimir Putin is considering the idea that his nuclear option is worth reminding the world about in the face of growing sanctions and opposition to the invasion of Ukraine. Joining me now is Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She's a professor of history at New York University. She's the author of the book Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present. Professor, this is brand new news. There have been people who over the last few days have talked about the things, the lines that the U.S. and NATO will not cross so as not to trip into, accidentally, World War III, particularly a war between nuclear powers. Vladimir Putin mentioned his nuclear arsenal the other day in declaring the invasion of Ukraine, which surprised some people. And now he has done something in which he said, we're putting them on high alert. What do you make of this news?
It's interesting how quickly he got this out. He did warn about it, but, you know, this is a perfect storm for Putin. And if you know autocrat psychology, none of this is surprising because he badly miscalculated. He didn't expect, he's elevated Zelensky to a world figure, leader of democracy. He's given new prestige and resolve to NATO. And two words, Ali, elite defection. So his oligarchs have started to speak out against him, Abramovich and Friedman, and this is a huge deal. Those people are just as transactional as he is, but this shows that his power, what he feared secretly and why he did this invasion, is not as stable. You have reports of Russian functionaries, state functionaries resigning, and of course the protests in St. Petersburg and elsewhere. So the nuclear card is showing it's very logical that autocrats become highly destructive and desperate, and we saw this with Gaddafi. But I think that there might be some intervention at the highest level if this nuclear posturing goes on.
The White House has issued a response to this immediately, saying at every step of this conflict, Putin has manufactured threats to justify more aggressive actions. He was never under threat from Ukraine or from NATO, which is a defensive alliance that will not fight in Ukraine. The only reason his forces face a threat today is because they invaded a sovereign country and one without nuclear weapons. This is yet another escalatory and totally unnecessary step. This is true. There was no threat to the Soviet Union or to Russia from Ukraine. There was never any threat. Russia invented at various times, you and I have been talking about it for weeks, a threat that NATO's been encroaching upon them, a threat that there are Nazis running Ukraine, the idea that there's a genocide of Russian-speaking people in Donetsk and Luhansk, none of which is true. But bottom line is this strategy, or should we be worried about Vladimir Putin and his state of mind right now, because he does have nuclear weapons?
We should be very worried because we're living through this cycle in history, and Putin is in my book, and I identified him as vulnerable in the paperback version that came out in October, because he, when you've been in power so long and you wield this kind of absolute power, you lose track of reality. And we saw these recent meetings where he was at these absurdly large tables with a lot of distance between himself and his Security Council. And this showed me he was very isolated, perhaps not getting good intelligence. Nobody wants to, to say things he doesn't want to hear. And this is an autocrat syndrome. And it's then that they do these things out of vanity, out of, delusions of grandeur. And this is what Ukraine was. But then if it backfires, the worst thing for an autocrat is to be humiliated. And between the response of the economic sanctions, there are things directed at Putin personally. All of these are lived as humiliations, and so they get into a very bad state of mind. And you can only hope that those around him who have power recognize that. And many times in autocratic history, starting with Mussolini, who was removed by his own Grand Council, there are solutions to when an autocrat gets too deranged.
Уважаемые коллеги, вы видите, что западные страны предпринимают не только недружественные действия в отношении нашей страны в экономической сфере, я имею в виду легитимные санкции, о которых все хорошо знают, но высшие должностные лица ведущих стран НАТО допускают и агрессивные высказывания в адрес нашей страны. Поэтому приказываю министру обороны и начальнику генерального штаба перевести силы сдерживания российской армии в особый режим несения боевого дежурства.
You could go to Grainger.com to find what you need to get the job done. Grainger, supplies and solutions for every industry.
See more, we can speak to our international affairs editor, Armin Georgian. Hello to you, Armin. This statement coming out just moments ago, we're still trying to sparse out what exactly it means, but give us an idea.
Well, it means that nuclear forces are being readied. It doesn't mean that they're going to be used, but I'm not sure it is actually that staggering, Will, to go back to your introduction, because as you also said, he did mention this nuclear issue in that address on the eve of the war, when he effectively issued a veiled statement about nuclear weapons to the West. He said, I'm slightly paraphrasing, but it was something like, if you interfere with what we're doing, you will meet a response that you have never experienced in your lives. That was clearly a reference to Russia's nuclear weapons. So I think today's statement, when you go back to what he said on the very eve of the war, it's actually not entirely surprising. But, of course, there have been these rising tensions with some in Finland, and some moves in Finland and Sweden expressing an interest in NATO, and that drawing a very stark response from the Russian government a couple of days ago only. So definitely the tensions are rising between Russia and the West, between Russia and NATO particularly. So certainly it looks like we could be approaching a very dangerous moment here.
Yeah, we don't know what aggressive statements he's alluding to, but we do know that more and more countries are offering military aid to Ukraine.
Well, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, what the West is doing is still focusing on this idea of direct help to Ukraine, rather than doing what a lot of Ukrainians that I've seen on social media are calling for, which is an actual no-fly zone. But I'm assuming that if there was to be much, civilian casualties on an even greater scale, the calls would mount for NATO to step in directly. The difference, of course, if you're talking about no-fly zones, the difference with something like Iraq in the early 1990s is that the West would be then in direct confrontation with a nuclear power. It's not the same as taking on, the Iraqi leadership, which at the time didn't actually have, the famous weapons of mass destruction, which were not even found after the Western intervention. So I think, here we're talking about a potentially much more dangerous situation. We're not there yet, but clearly the escalation is going up a notch now between the West and Russia.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Armin. Armin Georgian, French 24's International Affairs.